Greetings, quiet chroniclers of historical misfortune. Forget gleaming temples. Tonight, we journey to the blood-soaked bottom rung of the Aztec Empire, sometime around the 15th century. Imagine a life of ceaseless labor where the corn you harvested fed the priests, and your neighbor could be next on the sacrificial stone. This wasn't a civilization, it was a sophisticated machine designed to wring every drop of sweat, and sometimes blood from you. If tales of ancient misery are your twisted lullaby, then you are morally obligated to subscribe and hit the like button. Do it now, before the gods demand a different kind of tribute. In the early 1500s, the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan was a world wonder, a city of 200,000 floating on a lake. Its grandeur signaled absolute power. Towering pyramids and vast palaces dominated a metropolis larger than any in Europe. This was the glorious public face of the empire, a vision of wealth and divine right designed to inspire awe and obedience. For the elite, it was a paradise on earth, a testament to their closeness to the gods. For everyone else, well, that's where the story gets interesting and infinitely more miserable. This power was enforced by a terrifying military. Elite jaguar and eagle warriors, armed with obsidian-bladed clubs, were masters of conquest. Through relentless warfare, they carved out a vast empire of tributary states stretching across Mesoamerica. Their reputation for disciplined brutality preceded them. The sound of their drums alone was a weapon. They were the muscle behind the priests and nobles, the brutal instrument that kept the tribute flowing and the empire expanding. They were the guarantee that the system, as terrible as it was for most, would continue uninterrupted. But this golden structure was built on a foundation of human misery. Every temple stone and bushel of corn was extracted from millions of peasants, the maisuhuali. For them, the empire wasn't a source of pride, but a crushing burden. It was a divine pyramid scheme where all benefits flowed to the top, leaving the commoners with just enough to survive and continue working. Their lives were the grim reality hidden behind Tenochtitlan's golden mask. They were not citizens of a glorious empire. They were its fuel. So what was your life as an Aztec peasant? A relentless cycle of toil. Your day was spent on a muddy plot of land, a chinapa, cultivating the maize and beans that fueled the state. It was endless, back-breaking labor from dawn till dusk. The famous line captures it perfectly. Your emperors had floating gardens, you had calloused hands, and a nagging fear of sharp obsidian blades. Grandeur belonged to the nobility in their stone palaces. The grime and exhaustion belonged to you in your simple adobe hut. There was no overlap. The fruits of your labor were not yours. The Aztec tribute system was relentless extortion. A huge portion of your harvest, plus any textiles or pottery you made, went to the state. This wasn't a tax, it was the empire's lifeblood, feeding the armies and priests. On top of this, a labor draft could pull you from your farm at any time to haul stones for a new temple. The system was designed to keep you perpetually on the edge of survival, too poor and exhausted to ever dream of rebellion. Your purpose was to produce, and your reward was to not starve. Social mobility was a fantasy. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. Aztec society was a rigid caste system. Your destiny sealed at birth. You lived in a simple adobe hut, a world away from the stone palaces of the elite you supported. The law itself treated you differently. A nobleman might be fined for a crime. A peasant stealing corn could be executed. You weren't just stealing food, you were stealing state property. In the eyes of the empire, you were not a citizen to be protected, but a resource to be managed, and, if necessary, discarded. Hanging over this grim life was the shadow of human sacrifice. While the gods preferred the blood of captured warriors, their thirst was bottomless. In a crisis like a famine, priests might look closer to home for offerings. This was the ultimate psychological tool. The constant, bloody festivals were a public reminder of the state's power over life and death. It created a pervasive dread, knowing the cosmic order was lubricated with blood. You were just one bad harvest away from becoming a divine meal your heart offered to ensure the sun would rise again. The Aztec Empire was a marvel built on a crushing burden. For every noble who feasted, thousands of peasants toiled in misery, their lives consumed to fuel the imperial machine. This is the history hidden in the pyramid's shadow. If you believe these uncomfortable truths deserve a voice, then you must subscribe and smash that like button. It's the only tribute we can pay to the forgotten millions whose suffering built a civilization. Your subscription ensures these dark tales aren't lost to time. Do it now and join us on our next journey into historical misery. Welcome back to our tour of historical misery. Tonight, we're moving away from the battlefield and the sacrificial stone to look at something far more mundane, yet infinitely more terrifying for the average person: taxes. Oh, but don't you dare picture a stuffy office and confusing forms. The Aztec version of the tax office was less about paperwork and more about ensuring you paid what you owed, or else they'd take a pound of flesh, literally. This chapter is dedicated to the engine that powered the entire Aztec Empire, the tribute system. This wasn't just a way to fund public works. It was a vast, all-consuming vortex of goods, materials, and human life that flowed from the conquered provinces directly into the gaping maw of the capital, Tenochtitlan. For the millions of peasants living under Aztec rule, life was defined by one single, crushing question: have I produced enough to pay the state and still keep my family from starving? The agents of this system, the imperial tribute collectors, were known as the Calpiquesques. These men were not friendly civil servants. They were the most feared figures in the provinces, installed by the emperor to oversee his assets, and to them everything was an asset: the land, the crops, the animals, and you. They were the emperor's eyes and accountants, holding the power to ruin your life over a few missing beans. Their arrival in a village was a cause for profound anxiety, a harbinger of judgment. Let's begin with the basics. Food, the lifeblood of any empire. From every province, a river of sustenance flowed towards the capital. We're talking about staggering quantities of maize, beans, chia, and amaranth. One province alone might be required to send nearly 14,000 bushels of grain annually. This was the food you and your family grew, harvested with aching backs, and desperately needed for your own survival. But before you could take a single bite, the emperor's share was taken, destined for the storehouses that fed the nobility, the priesthood, and the army. Next on the list was clothing. The Aztec elite had a taste for fine textiles, and it was your job to satisfy it. Tribute lists, like those seen in the famous Codex Mendoza, demand mind-boggling numbers of woven cotton cloaks, loincloths, and women's tunics. Some provinces were on the hook for thousands of decorated cloaks every year. This required countless hours of labor from the women in the village, spinning thread and working on backstrap looms, turning raw cotton into wearable wealth for people they would never meet. Beyond food and cloth, the empire demanded the raw materials of civilization. Provinces were assessed based on their local resources. If your region had forests, you owed timber and wood. If you lived by a lake, you owed bundles of reeds for mats and baskets. If your area was home to the cochineal insect, you owed a tribute of that precious crimson dye, a substance more valuable than gold in many parts of the world. Your very environment was catalogued and monetized for the benefit of the state. Then came the luxury goods, the items that made the misery of it all feel so deeply unfair. From the tropical lowlands, tribute flowed in the form of impossibly vibrant feathers from quetzals and parrots, destined to be woven into the spectacular headdresses of rulers and warriors. You might be forced to deliver jaguar pelts, jade beads, turquoise, amber, and gold dust. Imagine being a poor farmer, risking life and limb to acquire these treasures, knowing they would adorn the body of someone who considered you less than human. The tribute system also had a distinctly military flavor. You weren't just feeding and clothing the empire, you were arming it. Conquered provinces were often required to provide the very tools of their own subjugation. This included thousands of shields, specialized warrior costumes complete with feathered crests, and the raw materials of war like sharp obsidian and flint for blades and arrowheads. It was a grim, self-perpetuating cycle. Your tribute armed the soldiers who would march on to conquer the next village. The sheer variety of demanded goods is a testament to the empire's obsessive level of control. The tribute lists are a strange and wonderful inventory of Mesoamerican life. They called for tribute in the form of live eagles, strings of chili peppers, gourds, sea salt, deer skins, and even bowls filled with yellow varnish for pottery. One of the most bizarre demands was for jars of honey, a sweet luxury for the elite, collected by peasants who rarely tasted such sweetness in their own lives. We know all of this with such painful detail thanks to surviving documents like the Codex Mendoza and the Matriculated Tributos. These aren't just historical artifacts, they are the empire's accounting books, its grim ledgers of extraction. Page after page, they use pictographs to meticulously record which of the 371 tributary towns owed what. Each town's symbol is listed next to drawings of cloaks, shields, grain, and gold dust, complete with symbols indicating the exact quantity. It was a bureaucracy of plunder. This system operated on an unforgiving quota. The amounts were fixed and non-negotiable. It did not matter if your region suffered from a drought, a flood, or a plague of locusts. The tribute was due, in full, and on time. There were no extensions, no appeals, no sympathy. The Kalpex would arrive expecting a specific amount, and failure to produce it was not seen as a misfortune, it was seen as defiance, an act of rebellion against the state and the gods themselves. And how did all this stuff get to Tenochtitlan? On your back. Mesoamerica famously had no draft animals like horses or oxen, and the wheel was used only for toys, not transport. This meant that every single bushel of corn, every bundle of cloaks, and every block of stone was carried by human porters known as tilame. These men were forced to carry loads of 50 pounds or more, trekking for days or even weeks across mountains and valleys to reach the capital. It was a brutal, often fatal part of the tribute process. The local tax collector, the Kalpiki, held immense power. He would inspect the tribute goods with a critical eye. If the cotton cloaks were not of the right quality, he could reject them. If the grain was deemed substandard, he could demand a larger quantity to make up for it. This gave him absolute life or death power over the villages in his charge. An ounce of his displeasure could mean the difference between a village surviving the year or facing catastrophic consequences. The burden of tribute was a communal one, which was a particularly cruel piece of psychological engineering. If one family failed to produce their share, the entire village was held responsible. This fostered a tense environment of mutual surveillance and immense social pressure. Your neighbors became extensions of the tax collector, ensuring you worked hard enough to meet your quota so that they wouldn't suffer for your failure. There was no room for compassion when everyone's survival was on the line. So let's address the big question. What happened if you simply couldn't pay? The initial punishments were designed for humiliation and financial ruin. The Kalpex could seize what little personal property you had, a few tools, a ceramic pot, a woven blanket. You and your family might be publicly shamed in the village square, a warning to others of the consequences of failure. This was the first turn of the screw, the beginning of a rapid descent into utter destitution. This is where we come to the user-submitted concept, which is so tragically accurate. Your taxes weren't just money, they were literally your lifeblood, or your corn's lifeblood, which was also your lifeblood. The tribute payment was not a surplus, it was the core of your production. Paying it meant walking a tightrope over a pit of starvation. A failure to pay didn't just mean you were in trouble with the state, it meant you had no food reserves left for yourself. Your debt was measured in your own survival. If public shaming and seizure of property didn't settle the debt, the next step was servitude. A peasant who defaulted on their tribute obligations could be forced into slavery. You could be sold to a wealthy merchant or a nobleman to work off the debt. More often, you would be forced to sell one of your own children into slavery to satisfy the state's demand. It was a devastating choice: lose your child's freedom or face even worse consequences for your entire family. And then there was the ultimate penalty. While enemy warriors were the preferred offering for the gods, the empire's thirst for blood was unquenchable. In times of great crisis, or when a province was particularly rebellious or repeatedly failed to meet its tribute quota, the demand could shift from goods to people. A village could be ordered to supply a certain number of its own inhabitants for sacrifice at the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. This was the final, terrifying expression of the Aztec state's power. It wasn't just that they owned your labor and your property, they owned your very body. A tribute demand for human lives was the ultimate tool of terror and control. It sent a clear message to all other provinces. This is the price for defiance. This is what happens when you fail to feed the empire. You will feed the gods instead. Your heart held aloft for all to see. This constant threat fostered a society drenched in anxiety. Every harvest season was a gamble. Every visit from the Kalprisk was a moment of potential doom. It wasn't just the physical hardship of the labor, it was the psychological torment of knowing that your life and the lives of your children were perpetually hanging by the thinnest of threads. This terror was not a bug in the system, it was the system's primary feature. It ensured obedience more effectively than any army could. This brutal system was also the engine of its own expansion. The vast amounts of food tribute fed the Aztec armies on their campaigns. The weapons tribute armed them. The luxury goods were used by diplomats to bribe and intimidate potential targets. The wealth, extracted from a newly conquered province, was immediately weaponized to bring the next region to heel. The misery of the peasants was recycled into fuel for the imperial war machine, a truly vicious cycle of oppression. In summary, the Aztec tribute system was a marvel of bureaucratic cruelty. It was a highly organized, ruthlessly efficient, and utterly inhumane mechanism designed for one purpose: to systematically strip the provinces of all their wealth, resources, and vitality, and funnel it to the imperial core. The gleaming city of Tenochtitlan was quite literally built upon a mountain of tribute goods, paid for by the suffering of millions. From the perspective of a peasant, your life was not your own. You were born into a debt that could never be fully paid. Your purpose, as defined by the state, was not to live, thrive, or be happy. Your purpose was to produce. You were a line item on an imperial ledger, a biological machine for converting sunlight and soil into corn and cotton for your masters. Your value was measured only by what could be taken from you. This level of institutionalized historical misery deserves to be remembered. The glorious temples of the Aztecs were cemented with the tears and blood of the common people. If you believe that digging up these grim foundations of history is important, then you have a solemn duty to subscribe to this channel. Liking this video sends a signal across time that these forgotten stories matter. Do not let the ghosts of these overburdened peasants go unheard. Click that subscribe button now and join us in the darkness. Greetings, weary travelers on the dark road of history. If you thought our previous discussion on the Aztec tribute system was the peak of peasant misery, I regret to inform you that you only paid for a ticket into the main event. Paying with your corn was one thing. The empire also demanded payment in the form of your time, your sweat, your muscle, and very often, your shattered bones. Welcome to the world of forced labor. This system had a name, cotaquitl. It sounds almost poetic, but it translates to a rotational labor draft, a form of corvée labor that was anything but. Think of it as a mandatory, unpaid, and profoundly dangerous temporary job assigned by the state. It was the empire's brilliant solution to a problem. How do you build a magnificent civilization of stone without money, machines, or a shred of concern for your workforce? You just force them to do it. The summons would arrive without fanfare. It wasn't a "we're hiring" notice. It was a demand. The village elders, under immense pressure from the imperial overseers, would be tasked with selecting the individuals whose turn it was to serve. This was a fantastic way for the empire to outsource the resentment. It wasn't some far-off official forcing you to go. It was your own community, your own neighbors, telling you it was your time to be fed into the imperial construction machine. And this wasn't an all-boys club of misery. While the men were drafted for the heavy, back-breaking tasks of hauling and lifting, the state had plans for the women too. They were often conscripted into support roles, forced to travel with the labor gangs to cook the meager rations, spin thread, and mend the tattered clothes of the workers. This ensured that the cotaquitl wasn't just a personal hardship, it was a disruption of the entire family unit, leaving homes and farms neglected. The most iconic projects, fueled by this river of forced labor, were the great temples. Imagine being a peasant, pulled from your simple hut and forced to work on a structure like the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. You were building a colossal house for Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, a deity whose primary interests seemed to be constant bloodshed and your corn tribute. The irony was as massive as the stones you were forced to carry. The process began in the quarries, miles away from the capital. Here, your job was to split multi-ton blocks of volcanic rock from the mountainside. Your tools were not feats of engineering. You had stone chisels, wooden wedges, and pure, unadulterated brute force. For weeks on end you would hammer and pry at the unyielding rock, every swing of the mallet a prayer that the stone would break before your spirit or your hand did. Once a block was finally freed, the real fun began. Without wheeled carts or beasts of burden, moving a stone the size of a small hut was a monumental task. This is where the sheer scale of the labor draft became apparent. Huge gangs of men, sometimes hundreds of them, would be assembled to drag the stone back to the city. Using a combination of log rollers, thick agave fiber ropes, and a great deal of synchronized grunting, they would haul the block across miles of uneven terrain. This was, to put it mildly, a health and safety nightmare. The path was never smooth. A misplaced log, a frayed rope, or a moment of lost coordination could send the multi-ton block shifting. Men were crushed, limbs were mangled, and lives were extinguished in an instant. The overseers likely viewed these workplace accidents with the same emotional detachment as a modern foreman seeing a dropped hammer. The supply of replacement workers was, after all, seemingly endless. But it wasn't just about building pretty temples for the gods. The Coatlicue was also responsible for the empire's critical infrastructure. The very causeways that connected the island city of Tenochtitlan to the mainland were built by these labor gangs. They constructed the massive dikes, like the one built under Emperor Nezahualcóyotl, to protect the city from floods. They dug the canals and built the aqueducts that carried fresh water into the heart of the capital. As if that wasn't enough, your forced labor could also be agricultural. The state, the temples, and the highest-ranking nobles all owned vast tracts of land, and they certainly weren't going to farm it themselves. So, after you tended your own meager farm plot to grow food for your family and for the tribute collectors, you could be drafted to go and work on their farms, for free. It was a system of layered exploitation, ensuring you were always working for someone else's benefit. The pace of the work was relentless, as captured by the user-submitted concept for this chapter. Your community service involved hauling massive stones for a sun god who mostly wanted hearts. From sunrise to sunset, you would labor under the watchful eye of supervisors whose only job was to ensure the work never stopped. There were no weekends, no holidays, and no sick days. Any pause, any moment of rest was seen as laziness, an insult to the gods, and a crime against the emperor. Your tools were as primitive as the system itself. For digging, you might have a fire-hardened wooden stick, a koa. For moving earth, you had a basket, which you would fill and carry on your back, held by a strap across your forehead. Building a pyramid wasn't just a matter of lifting stones. It was moving a mountain of dirt and rubble, one basket at a time, a task that would consume the lives of thousands. This labor draft wasn't a weekend project. A peasant could be called away from his home and family for weeks, sometimes months at a time. This was catastrophic for the household economy. His own crops might fail from neglect, his house might fall into disrepair, and his family would be left vulnerable. The Coatlicue didn't just take his labor, it jeopardized his family's entire future. And what did you get in return for this back-breaking service? A meal, if you could call it that. The state provided rations, but they were notoriously meager. A daily portion of maize, perhaps a few beans, was all that was offered to fuel a day of intense, calorie-demanding labor. The workers were in a perpetual state of hunger and exhaustion, making them incredibly susceptible to disease and injury. They were building an empire on an empty stomach. The overseers were not known for their gentle encouragement. They were enforcers, there to maintain discipline through fear. A worker deemed to be slacking could be beaten on the spot. Punishments were swift, brutal, and public, designed to serve as a warning to the rest of the crew. Complaining was not an option. Your only choice was to work until you were told to stop, or until you physically collapsed. From the state's perspective, the workforce was utterly disposable. The empire was vast, with millions of subjects. If a worker died from exhaustion, was crushed by a stone, or fell from a scaffold, it was of little consequence. Another man from his village would simply be drafted to take his place. This dehumanizing reality made the individual peasant feel like nothing more than a single, replaceable cog in a vast, uncaring machine. Beyond the immense physical toll, one can only imagine the psychological strain. Imagine the crushing hopelessness of it all. You are hauling a rock, every muscle screaming, to build a temple where the priests who live in luxury will perform rituals to appease the gods who demand your food and your labor. It's a level of systemic oppression that is hard to fathom, a constant reminder of your powerless place in the world. And for all this sacrifice, what was the reward? What was the payment for weeks of toil, hunger, and risk? Absolutely nothing. Your service was a duty, an obligation. The only reward was being allowed to return home at the end of your term, likely weaker, thinner, and haunted by what you had endured, only to face the challenge of putting your own neglected life back together before the next summons arrived. For every glorious pyramid that graced the Aztec skyline, there was an invisible monument of human suffering standing beside it. For every intricately carved stone, there was a pile of broken bodies. For every smoothly paved causeway, there were thousands of broken spirits. The visible grandeur of the Aztec Empire was built directly upon this unseen foundation of pain. The Quetzalcoatl was the engine that gave the empire its physical form. The tribute system fed the beast, but it was forced labor that gave it a body of stone and mortar. The beauty of Tenochtitlan, the city that so amazed the Spanish conquistadors, was a direct result of this brutal, unpaid, and deadly system of mass exploitation. This system, combined with the tribute demands, created a framework of total control. The empire didn't just take a portion of your wealth, it took a portion of your life, your time, your physical energy. There was no part of a peasant's existence that the state did not lay claim to. It was a comprehensive extraction of everything a human being could possibly produce. Let's place ourselves in the sandals of an Aztec peasant one last time. Your life is an endless cycle of labor. You work your own land to feed your family and to pay the tribute collector. Then you are taken from your home to work the state's land or to haul rocks for a temple. You return exhausted to start the cycle all over again. There is no rest, no escape, and no hope for a different future. The bitterest irony of all is that the peasants were forced to construct their own cage. They built the storehouses that held the tribute taken from them. They built the causeways that allowed Aztec armies to march out for conquest and return with prisoners for sacrifice. They built the very temples where the ideology that justified their oppression was preached and performed. The stones of the Templo Mayor are silent, but the story of the hands that built it is one of profound suffering. To ensure these stories are never silenced, you have an obligation to support this channel. Subscribing is the ultimate act of historical justice, a way to bear witness to the lives of those who were silenced by empires. Liking this video is a modern tribute to the forgotten laborers who built a civilization and got nothing in return. Do not let their sacrifice be in vain. Subscribe now. Greetings, my fellow chroniclers of historical hardship. We have journeyed through the terror of the Aztecs' tribute system and the back-breaking misery of their forced labor drafts. But tonight, we go to the source. We trade the temple and the quarry for the field and the farm. We are going to explore the daily, monotonous, and utterly exhausting grind that underpinned the entire empire. The life of a peasant farmer. This is where the glory of the empire meets the mud. For an Aztec commoner, the Mesoamerica, the sacred calendar, wasn't just a guide to religious festivals. It was a rigid, unyielding schedule of agricultural labor. There was no such thing as an off-season. Each of the 18 months in their calendar brought a new, mandatory set of chores dictated by the rhythm of the sun, the rain, and the insatiable hunger of the state. Your life was a checklist of toil, and you were never, ever allowed to fall behind. To accomplish the monumental task of feeding an empire, you were equipped with a shockingly simple set of tools. The star of this pathetic show was the koa, a fire-hardened wooden digging stick. That was it. No plow, no ox, no wheel. Your primary agricultural implement was, essentially, a pointy stick. Every furrow, every seed hole, every weed pulled was a direct result of human muscle power, a testament to what you can achieve when you have no other choice. Your existence was governed by the sun. As the user's concept for this chapter so perfectly states, your day began with the sun and ended when your back finally gave out. Before the first rays of light crested the mountains, you would rise in your small, smoky hut. A quick meal, likely a thin, maize-based gruel called atole, and then it was off to the fields. You would work until the sun had set, and you could no longer distinguish the weeds from the crop. Let's first visit the postcard image of Aztec agriculture, the famous chinampas. We call them floating gardens, but they didn't really float. A chinampa was a man-made island, a rectangular plot of hyper-fertile land built right in the middle of the shallow lakes of the Valley of Mexico. They were an absolute marvel of Mesoamerican engineering, a testament to ingenuity born of necessity. For the farmer, they were both a blessing and a curse. Building one of these was a monumental undertaking in itself. First, you would have to weave a large mat of reeds and anchor it to the lakebed with sturdy stakes. Then came the truly back-breaking part, piling layers of mud dredged from the canal floor onto the mat, along with decaying vegetation and waste, until you had built a new plot of land up out of the water. You were literally building your own farm, one basket of mud at a time, and the work never stopped. A chinapag was in a constant state of decay, always threatening to dissolve back into the lake from whence it came. The retaining walls had to be constantly reinforced. The canals between the plots had to be dredged regularly to prevent them from silting up. And that nutrient-rich mud from the canal floor, that was continuously scooped up and reapplied to the garden, a never-ending cycle of maintenance. The great advantage of the chinapap was its incredible fertility. Being constantly irrigated and built from rich lake-bedum sludge, these plots could yield up to 7 different harvests a year. This was fantastic news for the emperor and the tribute collectors. For you, the farmer, it meant the agricultural grind was perpetual. The moment one crop was harvested, another had to be planted. The workload was as relentless as the growth itself. On these fertile plots, you would cultivate the sacred trinity of Mesoamerican agriculture: maize, beans, and squash, often planted together in a symbiotic relationship. But you'd also grow tomatoes, avocados, and a wide variety of chili peppers. A significant portion of your chinapa might also be dedicated to growing flowers, not for your own enjoyment, but as a mandatory tribute for the endless cycle of religious festivals in Tenochtitlan. So while the chinapa system was an agricultural miracle, it was a miracle built on incessant human labor. The constant moisture meant a constant battle against weeds, which you would pull by hand. Planting was a slow process of poking holes in the soft earth with your koa and dropping in seeds. Harvesting the multiple crops throughout the year was an endless cycle of stooping, picking, and carrying. The chinapa was a highly productive prison, but it was a prison nonetheless. Now let's step away from the famous lakes and into the harsh reality for the vast majority of Aztec peasants. Most farmers did not have the luxury of a self-irrigating, super-fertile chinapa. Their lives were spent on much less forgiving lands, on the terraced slopes of hillsides or in the humid, overgrown lowlands. Here, the work was even harder, and the rewards were far less certain. For those living in hilly regions, the only way to farm was through terracing. This involved carving steps into the sides of steep hills, a process that was every bit as exhausting as it sounds. You would have to move enormous amounts of earth and build stone retaining walls to create a series of flat, farmable ledges. It was a staggering feat of landscaping, accomplished with nothing more than digging sticks, baskets, and brute force, but unlike the chinampas, these terraced fields were completely at the mercy of the elements. Water was a constant source of anxiety. Farmers had to painstakingly create small irrigation channels to divert water from mountain streams, a system that required constant upkeep. A season of little rain meant drought, and a season of too much rain could cause the retaining walls to collapse, wiping out a year's worth of labor in a single mudslide. In the lowland jungles, a different, equally grueling method was used: slash-and-burn agriculture, or tlacolol. This process involved first felling a section of forest with stone axes, a task that could take weeks. The downed trees and brush were then left to dry under the hot sun before the entire area was set ablaze. The resulting fire would clear the land for planting and create a thin, temporary layer of fertilizing ash. While effective in the short term, slash and burn was an incredibly inefficient and dangerous way to farm. The initial clearing of dense forest was exhausting. The fires themselves could easily burn out of control, threatening nearby villages, and worse, the thin jungle soil would be completely depleted of nutrients after just a few growing seasons, forcing you to abandon the plot and begin the entire arduous process all over again in a new patch of forest. On these less forgiving fields, you were fighting a constant war on multiple fronts. Weeds grew with a vengeance, competing with your precious crops for water and sunlight. Pests, from swarms of locusts to armies of rodents, could decimate your fields overnight. And with every harvest, the soil became a little poorer, a little less willing to give up its bounty. Your pointy stick and aching back were the only weapons you had against the slow entropy of nature. The most terrifying difference was the number of harvests. While a Chinapa farmer could expect multiple yields a year, providing a buffer against failure, a Terrace Tarcolo farmer often had only one shot, a single major crop of maize per year. This placed an incredible amount of pressure on that one harvest. A single hailstorm, a prolonged drought, or a bad infestation didn't just mean a poor yield, it meant absolute catastrophe. The agricultural year began with the planting season. This was a time of both intense labor and solemn ritual. The whole family would be out in the field. You would walk the rows, punching holes in the earth with your koa, while your wife or children followed behind, carefully dropping a precise number of seeds into each hole. Each seed was a prayer, a desperate hope offered to the gods that it would sprout and thrive. The growing season was not a time for rest. This was the season of weeding. For weeks on end you would be bent over in the hot sun, painstakingly pulling the unwanted growth from around the base of your maize stalks. This was crucial, tedious, and backbreaking work. It was a race to ensure that the precious water and nutrients in the soil went to your crops, and not to the resilient invaders trying to choke them out. Then came the harvest, the frantic climax of the agricultural year. This was a period of non-stop work from before dawn until after dusk. Every able-bodied person in the village would be in the fields, desperately trying to bring in the crops before they could be spoiled by rot or eaten by pests. Picking the maize, gathering the beans, hauling the squash, it was a race against time that pushed everyone to the absolute limit of their physical endurance. And what was the reward for a successful harvest? The brief, fleeting joy of a full storehouse was immediately shattered by the arrival of the local tribute collector. He would be there, ledger in hand, to claim the emperor's share. The best, plumpest, and most perfect ears of corn were not for you. They were loaded up and carted off to Tenochtitlan, leaving you with just enough, hopefully, to survive the coming months. People often speak of a farmer's off-season during the winter. This was a laughable concept in the Aztec world. The so-called quiet months were anything but. This was the time to mend your worn-out tools, repair the thatch roof of your hut, weave the cotton cloaks demanded for tribute, and of course be available for the kotetil, the forced labor draft that could call you away at any moment to haul stones for a new pyramid. The work was merely different, not absent. In the grand, bloody theater of the Aztec Empire, the farmer was the silent, anonymous stagehand. His relentless toil was the foundation upon which everything else was built. The priests chanted, the warriors fought, and the emperors ruled, all of it powered by the surplus food painstakingly coaxed from the soil by millions of faceless peasants. Their sweat was the true mortar, holding the empire's stones together. The Aztec pyramids were built on a foundation of stone, but the empire itself was built on a mountain of corn, watered by the sweat of nameless farmers. Their story is not written in glyphs on temple walls, it is etched into the very soil of the earth. To ensure these foundational stories of human history are not forgotten, you must subscribe. Liking this video is a salute to every person who has ever toiled in a field to feed a nation. Do not let their grind be for nothing. Click subscribe and honor the true builders of civilization. Welcome back, seekers of historical truth, to the dark corners of the Aztec Empire. We've talked about the tribute they paid and the temples they built. Tonight, we get even more personal. We're pulling up a reed mat, stoking the fire, and looking at what was on the dinner plate of an Aztec peasant. Spoiler alert, It wasn't a feast. For the common folk, food wasn't about cuisine, it was about calories. It was the fuel required to survive another day of being the empire's workhorse. At the absolute center of this diet, holding it all together, were the three sisters of Mesoamerican agriculture: maize, beans, and squash. This wasn't just a random collection of crops, it was a stroke of nutritional genius. When eaten together, the amino acids in the corn and beans combined to form a complete protein, similar to meat. It was a biological loophole that allowed a massive population to thrive on a largely vegetarian diet. For the peasant, this trio wasn't just food, it was life itself. But let's be honest, one of these sisters was the clear favorite, the overbearing matriarch of every single meal: maize. Corn was everything. It was the physical embodiment of their world. They ate it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You'd start your day with a warm, thin gruel called atol. For your main meal, you would have tortillas, thin, flat cakes of cornmeal cooked on a clay griddle called a comal. Or perhaps you'd have tamales, corn dough stuffed with, well, probably more vegetables, then steamed in a corn husk. The Aztec reliance on maize was so total that without one crucial technological breakthrough, the entire empire would have been a lethargic, disease-ridden mess. That breakthrough was nixtamalization. This is the process of soaking and cooking the corn kernels in an alkaline solution, usually water mixed with powdered limestone or wood ash. This simple chemical bath unlocked the niacin and essential amino acids trapped in the corn, making them available for digestion and preventing the debilitating deficiency disease, pellagra. Of course, a person cannot live on corn alone, no matter how chemically enhanced it is. Flavor, what little of it there was, came primarily from chiles. Hot, smoky, or sweet, peppers were added to almost everything to break up the monotony. Tomatoes and tomatillos added a bit of acidic tang, and if you were lucky, you might have access to the fatty, luxurious flesh of an avocado, though that was a rare treat for a commoner. Another key staple was amaranth, a hardy grain packed with protein, which was a vital part of the diet. When your own farm plot failed to provide enough variety, which it often did, you would turn to foraging. This wasn't a quaint weekend hobby, it was a necessary chore for survival. You would gather wild greens, edible mushrooms, and various roots. The nopal cactus was a key resource. Its pads could be cooked and eaten, and its fruit, the prickly pear, provided a burst of sweetness. The landscape was your reluctant pantry, offering up small handfuls of sustenance if you knew where to look. Now we come to the great challenge of the Aztec peasant diet, the protein problem. Without large domesticated animals like cows, pigs, or sheep, getting enough high-quality animal protein was a constant struggle. The nobility had their own sources, of course, but for the commoner, a slab of meat on the plate was the stuff of fantasy. This gaping hole in their diet had to be filled by any means necessary, which led to some rather creative culinary solutions. The most common source of hunted protein came in very small packages. As a peasant, you weren't tracking deer through the forest. That was a privilege reserved for the elite. Your hunting grounds were the fields and shrubs around your village. You would set snares for small rodents, possums, armadillos, and rabbits. A lucky farmer might occasionally bag a wild turkey, but these were rare windfalls, celebratory meals, not daily fare. The hunt was usually for something much smaller. As our user's concept so elegantly puts it, dinner was corn again. Your biggest culinary adventure was probably a grasshopper. Welcome to the main event of the peasant's protein intake, the six-legged steakhouse. Insects were a vital and abundant source of protein, fat, and vitamins. Toasted grasshoppers, or chapulines, were a common snack. You would eat ant larvae, known as escamoles, the caviar of the desert. You'd roast fat maguey worms and collect beetles. It wasn't just survival, it was a cornerstone of your diet. If you lived near the Great Lakes of the Valley of Mexico, your protein options expanded. You would skim the surface of the water for a blue-green algae called teculatl, known to us today as spirulina. This nutrient-rich scum was dried and formed into cakes, providing a powerful punch of protein and vitamins. You would also hunt for frogs, catch salamanders like the axolotl, and scoop up handfuls of aquatic insect eggs to add to your tamale. The lake was a murky but generous soup. The true dietary divide between the rich and the poor was stark. While you were snacking on toasted grasshoppers, the nobility in Tenochtitlan were feasting on venison, wild boar, ducks, and turkey. They even ate dog. A specific breed, the Xoloitzcuintli, was raised not just for companionship but as a source of meat for elite banquets. This wasn't for you. The best sources of meat were the property of the powerful, a constant, edible reminder of your lowly station. To wash all this down, you had the sacred and intoxicating gift of the maguey plant, pulque. This was the primary alcoholic beverage of the common people. The sap, or aguayel, was collected from the heart of the agave and allowed to ferment for a few days. The result was a milky, viscous, and sour beverage that packed a surprising nutritional punch, containing probiotics, vitamins, and minerals. More importantly, it offered a brief, cloudy escape from the harsh clarity of your daily existence. The entire peasant food system operated on a razor's edge. Even in the best of times, with a successful harvest, the tribute system ensured that you had virtually no surplus. Your family's storehouse was meant to get you through to the next harvest and nothing more. There was no safety net, no buffer against disaster. You were always just one bad season away from complete ruin. The most common trigger for this ruin was drought. The Aztec agricultural system was utterly dependent on seasonal rains. A failure of the rains for even a single season could lead to widespread crop failure. While the emperor and the nobility had massive granaries filled with tribute grain to see them through the hard times, you, the farmer who grew that grain, had nothing. Your fate was tied directly to the clouds. The most infamous example of this was the Great Famine of the mid-15th century, which began in the year called One Rabbit. A catastrophic combination of a decade-long drought, early frosts, and plagues of locusts led to an almost total collapse of the food supply. The historical chronicles from this time paint a horrifying picture of mass starvation, a period when the empire itself seemed on the verge of collapse. During these famines, the grim reality of survival took over. People ate anything they could find: roots, bark, insects, and vermin. Desperate families were forced to sell their own children into slavery to wealthy families in exchange for a few ears of corn. The social order frayed as people abandoned their villages in a desperate search for food. It was a stark reminder that beneath the veneer of imperial power lay a profound and terrifying fragility. Even when there wasn't a full-blown famine, chronic malnutrition was a constant companion for the Aztec peasant. Skeletal remains from this period tell a story of hardship. Archaeologists find evidence of stunted growth due to poor childhood nutrition. Skulls often show signs of porous bone, a condition called porotic hyperostosis, linked to severe iron deficiency anemia, and their teeth were often worn down to stumps from the stone grit that was inevitably ground into their daily cornmeal. Warfare was another harbinger of hunger. An Aztec army marching through your province was like a swarm of locusts, consuming local food stores. If you were drafted to fight or serve as a porter, your own fields would lie fallow, and if your city found itself on the wrong side of a conflict, an imperial siege was a death sentence. The enemy wouldn't need to break down the walls, they would just wait for everyone inside to starve to death. And what was the state's response to these famines? In the most extreme circumstances, the emperor might order the imperial granaries to be opened, distributing grain to the starving masses. However, this was often less an act of charity and more a calculated political move. It reinforced the people's dependence on the emperor, reminding them that he was the ultimate master of their life and death. The food came with invisible strings attached. In the end, the diet of the Aztec peasant was a masterpiece of survival and a portrait of profound scarcity. It was a nutritionally clever system, born of necessity, that managed to fuel a civilization. But it was also monotonous, bland, and perpetually insecure. Your daily meal was not a source of joy, it was the bare minimum required to continue your service to the state. The food on your reed mat was a direct reflection of your social status. The endless cycle of corn, the desperate search for protein in insects and vermin, the complete absence of the prized meats enjoyed by the nobility, every bite was a reminder of your place at the very bottom of the social pyramid. The taste of your food was the taste of oppression. It's a bitter historical irony that many of the staples of the Aztec peasant diet are now celebrated as superfoods in our modern world. Chia seeds, amaranth, spirulina, and high-protein insect flour are sold in health food stores for premium prices. For the people who originally depended on them, however, they were simply what was available, the humble ingredients that stood between them and starvation. Ultimately, the peasant diet was perfectly designed for the empire's needs. It provided just enough energy, just enough protein, and just enough sustenance to keep the great machine of agricultural production and public works running. The peasant was the engine of the empire, and corn was the cheap, low-grade fuel that made it go. Their culinary world was as small and constrained as their lives. The Aztec diet was a miracle of survival, but a nightmare of monotony. Every single tortilla was a symbol of their relentless, back-breaking grind. If you believe that understanding history means tasting the bitterness along with the sweetness, then you absolutely must subscribe to this channel. Liking this video is a nod to every culture that has ever made a feast from scraps. Do not let their story of resilience and scarcity be forgotten. Click subscribe and feed your mind with more dark history. Greetings, students of historical suffering and connoisseurs of ancient ailments. We've explored the Aztec peasants' brutal workload, their meager diet, and the crushing weight of tribute. Tonight we delve into an enemy even more relentless, an adversary that lived in their water, their food, and their very homes. We're talking about the invisible armies of disease and the daily, unwinnable war for basic health in the Aztec Empire. As the concept for tonight's descent into misery so aptly puts it, your greatest enemy wasn't always a warrior, sometimes it was just a particularly aggressive sneeze. Before we even consider the devastating diseases brought by the Europeans, it's crucial to understand that ancient Mesoamerica was no pristine paradise. It had its own robust and deadly collection of native pathogens, a whole rogues gallery of bacteria and viruses ready to capitalize on any weakness. This battle was made infinitely harder by a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The Aztecs had no concept of germ theory. They didn't know about microbes or viruses. Illness, in their worldview, was primarily a supernatural affair. It was a punishment from a displeased god, the result of a magical curse sent by an enemy or the work of malevolent spirits inhabiting the air. Sickness? Was it just a physical crisis? It was a spiritual one. This led to a strange paradox in Aztec hygiene. On one hand, they were famously clean people. The Spanish conquistadors were shocked by how frequently the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan bathed, often daily. The city itself had public latrines and teams of street sweepers. Yet, without knowing why sanitation mattered, this cleanliness was often superficial. A sparkling clean city could still have a catastrophically contaminated water supply. Let's start with the most common and lethal threat: gastrointestinal disease. With a large population and limited sanitation, dysentery and other forms of severe diarrhea were rampant. This was the #1 killer of infants and young children. An Aztec mother lived with the constant, terrifying reality that her child could be carried off by a bout of stomach sickness that was both common and largely untreatable. The main culprit was the water. While the capital city of Tenochtitlan had impressive aqueducts that brought in fresh water from springs on the mainland, the average peasant in a rural village wasn't so lucky. They relied on local streams, rivers, or wells. These water sources were easily contaminated by human and animal waste, turning the very sip was a gamble. Every sip was a gamble. Then there was the misery of skin infections. In a life defined by hard manual labor, cuts, scrapes, insect bites, and blisters were an everyday occurrence. In our world, we'd treat these with a simple antiseptic cream and a bandage. In their world, without effective antiseptics, any break in the skin was an open invitation for bacteria to set up shop. A simple cut from a sharp stone could quickly become a swollen, pus-filled, life-threatening infection. And of course, we can't forget the parasites. Both internal and external parasites were constant companions. Intestinal worms were a common affliction, contracted from contaminated food or water, silently stealing precious nutrients from their already malnourished hosts. Lice and fleas thrived in the thatch of their huts and the fibers of their cloaks, causing constant itching, discomfort, and potentially transmitting other diseases. The home itself could be a death trap. Peasant huts were small, single-room dwellings often shared with the entire family. They were poorly ventilated, and the smoke from the central fire pit would hang thick in the air. This environment was a perfect breeding ground for respiratory illnesses. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lung infections would have been incredibly common, especially during the cold, damp months of the year. This grim situation was made exponentially worse by their diet. As we've discussed, the peasant diet was monotonous and often nutritionally deficient. Chronic malnutrition suppresses the immune system, leaving the body with a weakened defense against any invading pathogen. A common cold that a well-nourished person could easily fight off could quickly turn into fatal pneumonia for a peasant living on the brink of starvation. Dental health was another arena of pain. The staple of their diet, stone-ground maize, was incredibly gritty. This constant abrasion wore down their teeth to stumps over time. This led to rampant cavities, painful abscesses, and infections that could spread to the jaw and beyond. With no real dental care beyond pulling the afflicted tooth, a simple toothache could be an agonizing and sometimes fatal ordeal. Beyond the everyday ailments, Mesoamerica was periodically swept by massive epidemics, known to the Aztecs as cocolixtli, a generic term for pestilence. Long before the arrival of smallpox, archaeological and historical evidence points to catastrophic plagues that killed millions. Recent studies suggest these may have been outbreaks of a native viral hemorrhagic fever, a terrifying disease that caused high fever and bleeding, wiping out entire communities. Now, it would be unfair to say the Aztecs were helpless. They had a sophisticated medical system and skilled healers known as Tenochtitlan. These individuals were not witch doctors. They were keen observers of the human body and masters of an extensive herbal pharmacopoeia. They knew how to set broken bones, stitch wounds with human hair, and prescribe remedies for a variety of ailments. The Aztec pharmacy was truly impressive. They utilized hundreds of local plants for their medicinal properties. They knew that willow bark contained a pain-relieving substance, the basis for modern aspirin. They used passion flower as a relaxant and antispasmodic. They had specific herbs to reduce inflammation, stop bleeding, and purge the body. It was a complex and effective system of botanical medicine. However, Aztec medicine was inseparable from religion. A healer would never just treat the physical symptoms. They would perform rituals, chant prayers, and use divination to diagnose the spiritual cause of the illness. Was the patient's heart out of balance? Had they offended the god of the earth? Curing the body and appeasing the gods were two sides of the same coin. One of the most important tools in the Aztec medical kit was the temazcal, or sweat bath. This was a small, domed structure that was heated to a high temperature, where water was thrown on hot rocks to create steam. The temazcal was used for both ritual purification and physical therapy. It was believed to cleanse the body of impurities, treat fevers, help with skin problems, and soothe the aching muscles of a weary farmer. Here we arrive at the most critical point: access. The highly skilled city, with their encyclopedic knowledge of herbal remedies, were concentrated in the cities and primarily served the nobility and the wealthy. An ordinary peasant living in a remote village would have had very limited, if any, access to this level of expert care. Their health care was by necessity a far more local affair. A sick peasant would most likely rely on the services of a village healer, who might have a good working knowledge of common herbal remedies. Or they would turn to folk medicine, a collection of traditions and cures passed down through their family. This would have been a mixed bag of genuinely effective treatments, useless superstitions, and potentially dangerous practices. And when the herbs and rituals failed, what then? When a disease progressed, despite the healer's best efforts, it was often interpreted as a final, unchangeable judgment from the gods. There was a powerful element of fatalism in their worldview. If the gods wanted you to die, you would die. At a certain point, medical intervention gave way to palliative care and preparing the soul for its journey to the afterlife. In the end, the health of an Aztec peasant was an incredibly precarious thing. They were caught in a crossfire between malnutrition, poor sanitation, constant physical labor, and a host of infectious diseases. They fought this war with a combination of impressive herbal knowledge and deep-seated superstition, but it was a war they frequently lost. The Aztec world thus presents a fascinating paradox. It was a society that engineered great aqueducts and organized street-sweeping brigades, yet its people suffered immensely from waterborne diseases. It was a culture with a deep understanding of botanical medicine, yet its rural majority had little access to it. It was a world of public cleanliness and private filth. This pre-existing burden of disease is what made the arrival of the Spanish so cataclysmic. The Aztec population was already stressed, malnourished, and reeling from its own native epidemics. They had no immunological defenses against old-world diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. When these new pathogens were introduced into this vulnerable population, the result was the Great Dying, one of the most severe demographic collapses in human history. For every peasant who had their heart cut out on a pyramid, hundreds, perhaps thousands more, died quietly and miserably in their huts. They died from a fever brought on by a drink of contaminated water. They died from a cough that turned into pneumonia in a smoky room. They died from an infected scrape on their hand. This mundane, unglamorous, and microscopic suffering was the true, everyday horror of their existence. The greatest and most glorious empires can be brought to their knees by the smallest and most invisible of enemies. The story of health and disease in the Aztec world is a powerful testament to that humbling truth. If you want to continue exploring the hidden, microscopic histories that shaped our world, then you must subscribe. Liking this video helps us fight the algorithm, the modern-day pestilence for all content creators. Do not let these important stories die out. Click subscribe now. Greetings, my fellow travelers into the dark heart of history. Thus far, we have catalogued the mundane miseries of the Aztec peasant, the back-breaking labor, the meager diet, the constant threat of disease. Tonight, we turn our gaze to a horror that was anything but mundane. This was the terror of a clear blue sky suddenly filled with war cries, the fear that your life of toil could end abruptly in a violent, state-sanctioned kidnapping. Welcome to the grim theater of the Flower Wars. The name itself, Xochiaoitl in the Nahuatl language, is a masterpiece of dark poetry. A flower war sounds almost beautiful, evoking images of chivalrous knights exchanging blossoms on the battlefield. The reality was infinitely more sinister. These were not wars for territory, tribute, or political dominance. They were ritualistic, prearranged conflicts waged for one single horrific purpose: to capture living human beings for sacrifice. The official reason for these gruesome events was cosmic. The Aztec worldview demanded a constant supply of human hearts and blood to nourish the gods, particularly the insatiable sun god Huitzilopochtli. Without this sacred sustenance, the sun would not rise, the universe would descend into chaos, and all of creation would end. The flower wars, therefore, were not seen as acts of aggression. They were a holy obligation, a necessary and sacred harvest to keep the cosmos in balance. But beneath this veneer of divine purpose lay a much more pragmatic and cynical state policy. The flower wars were an incredibly effective tool for the empire. They served as a live-fire training ground for the Aztec military, allowing young eagle and jaguar warriors to gain combat experience, practice their skills, and prove their valor without the risks of a full-scale war of conquest. It kept the imperial army sharp, disciplined, and battle-ready at all times. These conflicts were often bizarrely formal. The leaders of the Aztec Triple Alliance would enter into agreements with their traditional enemies, most famously the city-state of Tlaxcala, to meet at a designated time and place for battle. These sacred battlefields, or Cuauhtlali, became recurring arenas for this deadly sport. It was a grotesque parody of chivalry, a meticulously scheduled appointment for bloodshed. The combatants in these ritual clashes were typically the elite of the Aztec military. These were professional soldiers, nobles, and decorated veterans, men who lived for war and glory. Their goal was not simply to defeat the enemy, but to do so with skill and finesse. For them, a flower war was a chance to climb the social ladder, as their rank and status were determined almost exclusively by the number of captives they could take. This objective shaped the very nature of the fighting. In a flower war, killing an opponent on the battlefield was considered clumsy, a sign of poor skill. The ultimate prize was to subdue an enemy, wound them just enough to incapacitate them and take them alive. This required immense strength and dexterity. Your captor didn't want your corpse, he wanted your beating heart, and he needed it to still be beating when he got you back to the capital. The weapons of war were perfectly suited for this task. The infamous macuahuitl, a wooden club embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades, was not designed like a sword to pierce and kill. It was a tool for bludgeoning, maiming, and inflicting traumatic, disabling wounds. It could shatter a limb or knock a man unconscious, making him easy to capture. Spears and darts thrown with the atlatl were also used to weaken an opponent from a distance. But here is the crucial distinction for our story. While elite warriors fought each other on the designated battlefield, the flower wars also provided cover for something far more terrifying to the common person: raiding parties. These were not formal battles. These were armed gangs of Aztec warriors sweeping through the enemy countryside, and their targets were not soldiers. Their targets were you, the peasant farmer, working in your field. The communities most afflicted by this terror were those living in the volatile borderlands between the Aztec Empire and its staunch enemies, the so-called enemy confederations of Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, and Cholula. If you were a peasant living in this region, your life was a constant state of high alert. The threat of war wasn't a distant, abstract concept. It was a constant, imminent danger lurking just beyond the next hill. Imagine a perfectly ordinary day. You are out in your field, tending to your maize under the hot sun, the familiar ache in your back your constant companion. Suddenly the air is split by the haunting wail of a conch-shell trumpet, followed by the shouts of warriors. You look up to see dozens of men, adorned in vibrant feathers and terrifying regalia, charging out of the surrounding vegetation. For you, the world has just ended. The raid on your village or farming hamlet would be a whirlwind of calculated chaos. The warriors were not there to burn your hut or steal your grain. That was for a real war of conquest. They were there for you. Their movements were swift and precise, designed to overwhelm, isolate, and capture. They moved through your community like hunters, flushing out their human quarry. The moment of capture was one of pure animal terror. You would be set upon by a man who was stronger, better armed, and saw you not as a fellow human being, but as a divine offering. After a brief, hopeless struggle, you would be bound, your hands tied tightly behind your back. Your captor, his face a mask of grim purpose, would now be one step closer to promotion. You would be one giant leap closer to the altar. Then began the long, humiliating march to the enemy capital, Tenochtitlan. You would be paraded through hostile towns and villages, a living trophy symbolizing the power of the Aztec Empire and the skill of your captor. You were no longer a farmer with a name and a family. You were a piece of property, a future sacrifice, whose only remaining purpose was to die for the glory of a foreign god and the advancement of a stranger's career. This brings us to our user's grimly accurate concept. Your daily commute might end with you becoming a divine snack. In the Aztec worldview, a captive destined for sacrifice underwent a profound transformation. You became an Ixipla, a deity impersonator or image. You were no longer seen as a person, but as a sacred vessel for a god, a container of divine energy that would be released upon your death. This was the ultimate act of dehumanization. If your sacrifice was not scheduled immediately, you might be held in captivity for some time. In a truly bizarre twist of hospitality, high sinister captives were sometimes treated exceptionally well during this period. You might be cleaned, dressed in fine cotton cloaks, and fed sumptuous meals. This was not an act of kindness. This was the ritualistic fattening of the calf before the slaughter, ensuring you were a worthy and unblemished offering for the gods. For the peasants who were not captured, the psychological toll was immense. The constant threat of raids created a pervasive atmosphere of fear that poisoned everyday life. Every shadow, every unfamiliar sound, every rustle in the cornfield could signal an impending attack. It was a form of state-sponsored psychological warfare, keeping the borderland populations perpetually terrorized and off balance. For some captives, the end came in the form of the gladiatorial sacrifice. You would be tied to a large circular stone, the Tenochtitlan, by a rope around your ankle. You might be given a weapon made of wood and feathers and forced to fight against a series of fully armed and decorated jaguar and eagle warriors. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. It was a theatrical spectacle of bravery and doom, ending with your inevitable death. The more common fate, however, was a one-way trip up the towering steps of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. You would be part of a long, solemn procession, the air thick with the smell of burning copal incense and the stench of old blood. The sound of drums would echo in your ears as you were painted and adorned for your final sacred role. At the summit, before a massive crowd, you would be forced onto your back over the sacrificial stone, your limbs held fast by 4 priests. A 5th priest would then raise a razor-sharp obsidian knife and, with practiced efficiency, slice open your chest, reach into your body, and pull out your still-beating heart. Your heart would be offered to the sun, and your body would be tumbled down the steep temple steps. For your captor, your death was a triumph. He would be rewarded with titles, land, and the right to wear more elaborate clothing. He was a hero of the state. For your family back in your village, your disappearance meant a lifetime of grief and uncertainty. You were simply gone, vanished into the hungry maw of the empire, your death fueling the very system that terrorized you. The Flower Wars were a perfect multi-purpose tool of empire. They were a religious necessity, a military training exercise, and a brutal form of political intimidation, all wrapped into one bloody package. For the peasant living on the front lines of this perpetual conflict, it represented the most immediate and terrifying expression of the state's power over their life and body. Ultimately, the life of an Aztec peasant was an unwinnable war fought on all fronts. If the crushing tribute demands didn't break you, the back-breaking forced labor might. If the rampant diseases didn't claim you, a sudden famine could. And if by some miracle you managed to survive all of that, a flowery warrior in a glorious headdress might just decide you'd make a fine gift for the sun god. The Flower Wars were the Aztec state's most gruesome and direct form of human resources. This brutal reality of history is often glossed over with poetic names and talk of ritual, but not here. If you believe these dark, uncomfortable truths deserve to be dragged into the light of day, then you must subscribe. Liking this video is a vote for unvarnished, unflinching history. Help us continue our mission to capture these stories before they are lost forever. Click subscribe now. Greetings, my fellow morbid historians, and welcome back to the Pyramid of Peasant Suffering. We have journeyed through fields of endless toil and households plagued by disease and hunger. Tonight, we arrive at the summit. We climb the final, steepest steps to confront the most infamous and terrifying aspect of Aztec life. This is the chapter on human sacrifice, the ultimate and most personal tax demanded by the empire. Let's begin by addressing the cosmic justification for this river of blood. To the Aztecs, the universe was not a stable, permanent creation. It was a fragile, violent entity born from the self-sacrifice of the gods. They believed the world had been created and destroyed 4 times before their own era, the 5th sun. To prevent their own world from meeting a similar cataclysmic end, they had to repay their cosmic debt. They had to feed the gods with the most precious substance imaginable, chalchihuatl, or precious water, human blood. The chief recipient of this grim sustenance was the patron deity of the Aztecs, the sun and war god Huitzilopochtli. In their mythology, every single dawn was a cosmic battle. Huitzilopochtli, the sun, had to fight his way out of the underworld and defeat his siblings, the stars and the moon, who represented the forces of darkness. To have the strength for this daily struggle, he required a constant supply of fresh human heart. Without them, he would weaken, the darkness would triumph, and the sun would fail to rise. But Huitzilopochtli was not the only thirsty deity in the Aztec pantheon. A diverse and demanding roster of gods required their own specific forms of sacrifice. Xtlaloc, the powerful and feared god of rain and storms, demanded the tears and hearts of children, believing their pure sorrow would beckon the life-giving rains. Totec, Our Lord, the flayed one, the god of agriculture and rebirth, required a victim to be skinned alive, with a priest then wearing the flayed skin to symbolize the earth shedding its old layer to bring new growth. The most valuable offerings for the gods were, famously, brave enemy warriors captured in the Flower Wars. A defiant, courageous heart was considered the most potent form of nourishment, a truly worthy gift for the sun god. These captured soldiers knew their fate and were expected to meet it with a stoicism that blurred the line between victim and participant, a final act of martial valor on the sacrificial stone. But the sheer demand for victims far outstripped the supply of captured enemy warriors. This is where the terror trickled down to every level of society, including the humble peasant. The gods were not picky about where their meals came from, only that they arrived on time. When the supply of enemy soldiers ran low, or when a special occasion demanded a larger offering, the state began to look for victims closer to home. Tribute, as we have seen, was paid in goods and labor, but it could also be demanded in a human form. A province that was rebellious or one that had recently been conquered might be ordered to provide a quota of people for an upcoming religious festival. A village elder would be given the horrific task of selecting which men, women, or even children from his community would be sent on a one-way trip to the altars of Tenochtitlan. Other sources included criminals and debt slaves. While not all slaves were destined for the altar, a specific class known as Tlahtlacotin could be offered up by their masters. If you committed a serious crime, your sentence might not be imprisonment, but a date with the obsidian knife. This served as both a religious offering and a powerful deterrent, a way for the state to cleanse itself of undesirable elements. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching practice was the sacrifice of children to Tlaloc. These ceremonies often took place at mountain shrines during the dry season. The children, often dressed in fine blue garments to imitate the color of water, were made to cry on their way to be sacrificed. Their tears were not seen as a sign of their terror, but as a sympathetic magic, a sacred offering that would move the rain god to water the desperate earth. For the average peasant, this created a terrifying lottery. You could follow all the rules, pay your tribute, perform your labor, and still be chosen. A prolonged drought might require a special offering to Tlaloc. The dedication of a new temple might demand thousands of hearts to sanctify it. You might not be a warrior, a slave, or a criminal, but if the priests decided the gods were hungry, your number could be up at any time. The grim reality of famine also fed the sacrificial system. During times of mass starvation, such as the Great Famine of One Rabbit, desperate parents were sometimes forced into the most unimaginable choice: watch all their children slowly starve, or sell one child into slavery for a handful of corn. They knew this was likely a death sentence, but it was a choice between a certain death for all and a probable but quicker death for one. Crucially, these rituals were not hidden away. They were the biggest public spectacles in the Aztec world, a form of state-sponsored theater designed for mass consumption. They were performed on the highest platforms of the Great Pyramids in full view of tens of thousands of people gathered in the plazas below. This was not just a religious act, it was a political statement. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of psychological conditioning. The victims, or acceptor, were treated as divine impersonators. They would be ritually bathed, painted in symbolic colors, and dressed in the elaborate regalia of the god they were to become one with. They were paraded through the city, adored by the crowds, a living, breathing icon on their way to a holy death. At the summit of the pyramid, the air would be thick with the smell of copal incense and the metallic tang of blood. The victim would be seized by 4 priests and stretched backwards over the sacrificial stone, or Tecatl, their limbs held fast. A 5th priest, the most senior, would then step forward, brandishing the ceremonial knife. The moment was one of sacred, heart-stopping silence. This is where we arrive at the user's grimly perfect summary. You literally paid taxes with your heart. Talk about high stakes. The priest would make a swift, deep incision below the ribcage, reach into the chest cavity, and tear out the still-beating heart. He would hold it aloft, a steaming offering to the sun, before placing it in a sacred vessel. It was the ultimate payment, the final tribute. The now lifeless body had its own role in the ceremony. It was unceremoniously tumbled down the steep, blood-slicked steps of the pyramid, a dramatic end to the public portion of the ritual. At the bottom, the corpse was often dismembered. While the extent is debated, evidence suggests that parts of the body were sometimes taken by the captor or other elites for ritual cannibalism, a final, horrifying act of consumption. And heart extraction was not the only method on the menu. As we've seen, child victims for Tlaloc were often sacrificed at mountain shrines. For festivals honoring the hunt god Mixcoatl, victims might be tied to a post and shot with arrows so their dripping blood would symbolically fertilize the earth. And for Xipetotec, the victim was flayed, their skin worn by a priest for 20 days in a gruesome ritual of rebirth. The purpose of making this so public was clear. It was a terrifying and brutally effective tool for social control. By witnessing this awesome and horrific power, every citizen was reminded of the absolute authority of the gods, and by extension, the emperor, who was their chief representative on earth. It was a clear message to any potential rebels or dissidents. This is the power we command. This is what happens to the enemies of the state. Obey. The sheer scale of this practice is difficult to comprehend. While the exact numbers are a subject of intense historical debate, with some early Spanish accounts likely being exaggerated, even the most conservative estimates are staggering. It is believed that thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people were sacrificed across the empire every single year. The dedication of the Great Pyramid in Tenochtitlan in the year 1487 alone is said to have involved the slaughter of thousands of victims over a 4-day period. This was not a marginal or fringe practice. It was the central axis around which Aztec society revolved. Their magnificent art is filled with images of sacrifice. Their towering architecture was designed specifically to facilitate it. Their complex calendar was a schedule of festivals that demanded it. Their politics, their warfare, and their economy were all inextricably linked to this constant ritualized flow of human blood. From the peasant's perspective, this transformed the world into a landscape of fear. The great pyramids that dominated the skyline were not symbols of civic pride, they were industrial-scale slaughterhouses. The colorful religious festivals were not occasions for celebration, they were deadlines for death. Your relationship with the gods was not one of love or comfort, but one of abject transactional terror. Human sacrifice was the ultimate and final expression of the state's power. The empire demanded your crops as tribute, it demanded your time and energy as forced labor, and when the cosmos needed balancing, it demanded your very life. It was the total and complete consumption of the individual, their body and soul becoming nothing more than fuel to keep the imperial machine running. It is a profound challenge to our modern minds to truly grasp a worldview that saw such institutionalized violence not as evil, but as a sacred, moral, and absolutely necessary act. This was not murder in their eyes, it was a holy obligation, the only thing preventing the end of the world. It was a reality where the line between piety and brutality was not just blurred, but completely erased. The steps of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan ran red with the ultimate tax payment, the final, bloody tribute of a people trapped in a terrifying cosmic bargain. This is the brutal, core truth of the Aztec Empire. If you have the stomach for more history that is raw, real, and unapologetically dark, then you must subscribe. Liking this video tells us you want the truth, no matter how unsettling it may be. Don't let the voices of these victims be silent. Click subscribe and join our inquest into the past. Greetings, members of the jury, and welcome to the courtroom of history. Tonight, we put the Aztec legal system on trial. We've seen how the peasant was squeezed for tribute, worked to the bone, and offered up to the gods. Now, we examine the very rules that governed this life of misery. The Aztecs had a complex, sophisticated, and deeply ingrained legal code. But for the commoner, this system was rarely a source of protection. It was just another instrument of control, another wall in their social prison. The Aztec world was built on a foundation of absolute order. Their society was a rigid pyramid with the emperor at the top and millions of peasants forming the base. Chaos, disorder, and laziness were seen as existential threats to this structure. The legal system, therefore, was designed with one primary goal in mind: to viciously defend that order. It was less about determining guilt or innocence, and more about reinforcing everyone's proper place in the grand imperial machine. For a society without a sprawling bureaucracy of lawyers, they had a surprisingly organized court system. At the lowest level, you had local courts, often held in the bustling marketplace, which would swiftly handle minor disputes and petty crimes. Above that were appellate courts, and at the very top, special high courts in the capital, Tenochtitlan, reserved for judging the nobility. The emperor himself was the ultimate supreme court, the only one who could pass judgment on the highest-ranking members of society. The laws themselves were not written down in books. They were a powerful oral tradition, a complex code of customs, precedents, and imperial decrees memorized and passed down through generations of judges. While this allowed for a certain flexibility, it also gave immense power to the judges. For a peasant standing before them, the law was whatever the judge said it was on that particular day. There was no manual to consult, no loophole to find. Let's look at some common crimes from the peasant's perspective. One of the most serious offenses you could commit was theft. In a system where every single ear of corn was accounted for, stealing was not just an offense against an individual, it was a crime against the state and the gods. You were disrupting the flow of tribute and threatening the stability of the entire community. The state did not take this lightly. The punishment for theft was naturally brutal and swift. If you were caught stealing something of little value, you might be forced into slavery to your victim until your labor had repaid the debt. But for stealing something more valuable, like a significant amount of maize or a precious cloak, the penalty was often death. You would be taken to the marketplace and publicly strangled or stoned to death, your body left as a gruesome warning to others. Public drunkenness was another major sin for a commoner. While the nobility could enjoy pulque, the fermented agave drink, at their private feasts, for a member of the working class to be intoxicated in public was a sign of moral decay. It represented a loss of control, a descent into laziness and chaos that the state could not afford from its labor force. This was not a moral failing, it was an economic one. The consequences for this indulgence were severe. If caught drunk for the first time, your punishment might be public humiliation, your head would be shaved, a mark of deep shame, and in some cases, your house would be torn down by the angry community. If you were foolish enough to be caught a second time, the punishment was often death. The state demanded sobriety from its subjects, not for their health, but for their productivity. The law also governed the family with an iron fist. The family unit was the core of the state's production and tribute system, so it had to be stable. Adultery was therefore considered a heinous crime that threatened this stability. An unfaithful husband or wife could expect no mercy. The typical punishment for both guilty parties was death by stoning, often carried out by the aggrieved members of their own families. Even your words could get you into trouble. Slander, gossip, or spreading malicious rumors was a crime. In a small, tightly knit village, or kalpuli, such talk could disrupt the social harmony and lead to feuds, which in turn could impact the community's ability to work and pay tribute. A particularly nasty gossip might find their lips being publicly cut off, a gruesome and effective way to silence them permanently. As the user's concept for this chapter states, the law was less about justice and more about maintaining social order, usually by making an example out of you. For a peasant, a trial was a swift and terrifying affair. There was no presumption of innocence. You would be brought before a judge, accusers would present their case, and perhaps a few witnesses would speak. The verdict would be delivered quickly, and the punishment, often carried out immediately in public, was designed to be a memorable lesson for everyone watching. Many of the most minor disputes, a squabble over land boundaries, a minor personal insult, were handled at the local level by the kalpuli elders. This was a form of community justice, a way to maintain peace without involving the higher courts. But even here, the principles of Aztec law held sway: maintain order, punish transgression harshly, and ensure that nothing disrupts the all-important flow of labor and tribute to the state. Now, here is where the Aztec legal system gets particularly interesting and reveals its true purpose. On paper, a noble who committed a crime was often punished more severely than a commoner for the exact same offense. This seems counterintuitive, a system that holds the powerful to a higher standard, but the logic behind it was rooted entirely in the preservation of the class structure. The official rationale was that nobles were supposed to be the moral and behavioral role models for the entire empire. They had been given a fine education, they held positions of power, and they were expected to embody the Aztec ideals of discipline, stoicism, and piety. A crime committed by a noble was a far greater betrayal than one committed by an ignorant peasant. It was a stain on the entire ruling class, and it had to be viciously scrubbed out. The trial of a noble was a different affair entirely. It would be held in a higher court, often in private, to avoid a public scandal that could undermine the authority of the nobility. The judges would be their peers, other high-ranking nobles, and for the most serious cases involving the highest elite, only the emperor himself could pass judgment. This was justice kept strictly in the family. This double standard had stark consequences. A commoner caught drunk in public might be shamed and have his house torn down. A nobleman caught in a similar state of public intoxication could be stripped of his rank and titles and quietly executed. A peasant who stole might become a slave. A noble who stole had proven himself utterly without honor and would be put to death without hesitation. But, and this is the most important but in the entire legal system, this was all true only in theory. The reality on the ground was starkly different. While the punishments for nobles were harsher on paper, the chances of a noble ever being brought to trial were infinitesimally small. They possessed the power, the wealth, and the political connections to cover up their crimes, intimidate accusers, and silence witnesses. The peasant had no such recourse. The system was ripe for a level of corruption that the law officially condemned. A peasant's word against a nobleman's was practically worthless. A noble could abuse, exploit, or even murder a commoner and face few, if any, legal consequences. The law existed to punish peasants who stepped out of line and to punish nobles who were clumsy enough to get caught, bringing shame upon their class. For everyone else, power was its own law. For the peasant, one of the most common outcomes of a legal entanglement was slavery, or tlacotli. This was not the chattel, race-based slavery of other empires. It was a legal status, a form of indentured servitude that one could fall into for a variety of reasons. Most commonly, it was a punishment for a crime, like being unable to pay a debt or being convicted of theft. You could even enter slavery voluntarily. During a famine, a desperate peasant could sell himself or one of his children to a wealthy family in exchange for food. This was a last resort, a way to survive a catastrophe, but it meant surrendering your freedom for an unknown period of time, subject to the whims of your new master. Strangely, Aztec slaves had certain rights. They could marry, have children who were born free, own property, and even own slaves of their own. It was in theory possible to work off your debt or buy back your freedom. However, this semi-humane system had a dark and terrifying loophole that led directly back to the sacrificial stone. If a slave was disobedient, lazy, or attempted to escape, their master could have them fitted with a heavy wooden collar. This was a final warning. If a collared slave was taken to be sold in the great marketplace, they could be purchased for a specific purpose: human sacrifice. Their legal status as a disobedient slave made them eligible for the altar. For a peasant, the path from a minor crime to the top of the pyramid was terrifyingly short. In the final analysis, the Aztec legal system was a finely tuned instrument of social control. It was not designed to be fair, it was designed to be effective. It effectively protected the property and privileges of the state and the nobility. It effectively terrorized the peasant population into obedience and productivity. For the commoner, the law was not a shield to protect them, but a hammer always poised to strike. The scales of Aztec justice were permanently, deliberately tipped. The law was not blind, it stared right at you, judged your social status, and sentenced you accordingly. This grim reality is a powerful reminder that law and order can often be a code for oppression. If you want to continue to put history on trial and expose these uncomfortable truths, you must subscribe to this channel. Liking this video is your verdict in favor of real, unvarnished history. Pass judgment now, click subscribe. Greetings, weary souls, and welcome back to our chronicle of Aztec peasant life. We have walked the muddy fields, tasted the meager diet, feared the obsidian knife, and trembled before the law. Tonight we confront one of the most fundamental questions of any society. Can you change your stars? Can a person born into poverty and toil rise to a life of comfort and power? For the Aztec peasant, the answer was a resounding, soul-crushing no. In the modern world, we are often told stories of social mobility, of climbing the ladder of success. The Aztec Empire, however, was not interested in such stories. Its ladder was missing most of its rungs, and the ones that remained were coated in blood. The Aztec dream was not about achieving greatness. For a peasant, it was the simple, desperate dream of surviving until the next sunrise. Aztec society was fundamentally split into two rigid classes, a division ordained by the gods and enforced by the state. At the top were the pipiltin, the hereditary nobility. They were the commanders, the high priests, and the government officials. At the bottom were the masehuald, the commoners, the vast peasant class whose sole purpose was to work and support the elite above them. This wasn't a suggestion, it was your destiny, sealed at the moment of your birth. Life as a pipil was a world away from the grime and toil of the fields. Nobles owned land privately, a right denied to commoners. They were exempt from paying tribute and performing manual labor. They lived in spacious stone houses, wore fine cotton clothing adorned with precious feathers, and sent their children to exclusive schools to study subjects like philosophy, law, and statecraft. Theirs was a life of privilege, power, and high-protein meals. Contrast this with the life of a Maseol, which we have explored in such grim detail. You lived in a one-room adobe hut. You worked land that belonged not to you but to your local community group, the Calpulli. You paid a crushing portion of your harvest in tribute. You could be conscripted for forced labor or military campaigns at a moment's notice. Your life was one of obligation, service, and unending labor. The Calpulli, the network of families that made up your local district, was the central unit of your social world. It provided a sense of identity and community, and it managed the communal lands you worked. But it also served as a powerful mechanism of social control. It was the Calpulli that organized the tribute payments and assigned labor duties. It locked you into your community, and by extension, your predetermined place in society. So, was there any way out? Were there any paths leading up from the bottom of this pyramid? In theory, yes. In practice, they were exceptionally narrow, fraught with peril, and an almost statistical impossibility for the vast majority. The system was designed for stability, and social mobility was the enemy of stability. The most famous, and perhaps the only truly viable path for a commoner to improve his station was through warfare. The Aztec military was a meritocracy of sorts, but the merit was measured in human lives. A peasant man, upon coming of age, would receive basic military training and could be called up to serve in the empire's frequent campaigns. This was his lottery ticket. The price of glory was steep. To even begin to be noticed, a commoner soldier had to display exceptional bravery and skill. But the key metric for advancement was not how many enemies you killed, it was how many you captured alive. As we've discussed, taking a captive was far more difficult than killing them, and it was the only way to earn military honors and ascend the ranks. The system was brutally specific. Capturing your first enemy was a great achievement, but it didn't change your life much. Capturing 2 or 3 might earn you the right to wear certain adornments, but if by some miracle of skill and luck you managed to single-handedly capture 4 or 5 enemy soldiers, you could be elevated to the esteemed ranks of the eagle or jaguar warriors. This was the jackpot. It granted you some of the privileges of the nobility and a life away from the farm. But we must be brutally realistic about this path. For every one commoner who became a famed warrior, thousands died anonymously on the battlefield. Most were poorly equipped foot soldiers, the cannon fodder of the empire. The path of the warrior was less a genuine opportunity and more a convenient piece of state propaganda, a sliver of hope that kept young men willing to fight and die for an empire that gave them almost nothing in return. The only other significant avenue for escape was the priesthood. A family could dedicate a promising child to the service of a temple. If accepted, that child would be spared a life of manual labor. They would enter the Kalmakak, the school for priests, and receive an education. They would learn to read and write the complex system of Aztec glyphs, study astronomy and the sacred calendar, and learn the intricate doctrines of their religion. This path, however, was its own form of prison. The life of a lower-ranking priest was one of extreme austerity and brutal self-discipline. It involved long hours of prayer, constant fasting, and ritual bloodletting, where they would pierce their own bodies to offer blood to the gods. And of course their duties included performing the grisly rites of human sacrifice. It was an escape from the farm, but an escape into a world of ritualized pain and gore. Furthermore, even within the priesthood there was a hard glass ceiling. A commoner could become a respected local priest, a powerful figure in their own community, but they could never reach the top. The highest and most powerful positions, such as the twin high priests of the great temple of Tenochtitlan, were exclusively reserved for members of the hereditary nobility. The heavens, like the earth, had a class system. It is a grim testament to the Aztec social structure that there were far more ways to move down the ladder than to move up. Social demotion was a constant threat, a danger that loomed over every peasant household. While climbing was nearly impossible, falling was terrifyingly easy. The most common trapdoor leading downwards was slavery. As we've seen, Aztec slavery, or tlacotli, was a legal status, not an inherited one. It was a pit that thousands of peasants fell into over the course of their lives. It represented a catastrophic loss of the little freedom and status they possessed. All it took was a single failed harvest. A drought, a flood, or a pestilence could wipe out your crops, leaving you unable to pay your tribute. To survive, you might be forced to take a loan of grain from a wealthy merchant or a noble lord. The interest rates were crippling. Unable to repay the loan, you would be forced to pay with your own labor, becoming a debt slave to your creditor. The legal system, as we've explored, was another efficient mechanism for pushing people into servitude. A peasant, driven by hunger, who stole a few ears of corn could be sentenced to slavery. In a society with no safety net, a single misstep, a single moment of desperation, could cost you your freedom. This brings us to the user's wonderfully dark concept for this chapter. Your career trajectory was basically born a farmer, die a farmer. Unless you got sacrificed, then you were a divine offering. This wasn't just a career change, it was the ultimate involuntary demotion. Whether you were captured in a flower war, sold as a disobedient slave, or chosen to appease a hungry god, sacrifice was the final, terrifying endpoint for many who started life at the bottom. The entire system was structured to ensure its own perpetuation. Widespread social mobility would have been seen as a threat to the cosmic order. The state needed a permanent, stable, and obedient workforce of millions to function. The paths leading down, slavery and sacrifice, were not bugs in the system, they were features. They were powerful tools of fear that helped keep the peasant class in its designated place. This worldview was reinforced from the moment a child was born. You were taught that the universe was structured this way for a reason. The gods had chosen the Pipiltin to rule and the Mesoamerica to work. To question this was to question the very fabric of creation. Your purpose was clear, divinely ordained, and unchangeable. The separate education systems cemented this division. A noble child learned how to rule. A peasant child attended a different school, the Telpokkolai, where the curriculum focused on practical skills, farming for boys, weaving for girls, and basic military training for all. The most important lesson, however, was discipline and obedience to your superiors. It was an education for servitude. The rare success stories, the handful of commoners who became legendary warriors, were worth more to the state than 1,000 military victories. These stories were powerful propaganda. They created the illusion of opportunity, a belief that anyone, through bravery and piety, could achieve greatness. It was a lie, but it was a useful lie. It gave people a sliver of hope, and hope is a far more effective tool of control than pure despair. In the final judgment, for the overwhelming majority of people born into the Aztec peasant class, social mobility was a cruel fantasy. Your life was predetermined. You were born on the land, you worked the land, you paid tribute from the land, and you were buried in the land. Your destiny was not in your hands, it was in the hands of the nobles, the priests, and the gods they claimed to represent. The Aztec social ladder was a lie, a cruel illusion dangled in front of millions who were born at the bottom and destined to stay there. The story of their struggle against an immovable system, their lives lived within this rigid cage, is a vital piece of our shared human history. To help us continue to dismantle these historical myths and expose the grim realities beneath, you must subscribe. Liking this video is your statement that the stories of the powerless do not let their hopeless reality be forgotten. Click subscribe now. Greetings and welcome to the final chapter of our descent into the world of the Aztec peasant. We have examined the aches of their bodies from endless labor, the emptiness of their stomachs from tribute and famine, and the fear in their hearts from war and sacrifice. Tonight we explore the heaviest burden of all, the immense, crushing weight upon their minds. This is the story of the psychological toll of living at the bottom of the Aztec Empire. Imagine, if you can, a life lived under a constant, low-humming symphony of fear. There was the agricultural fear of a drought or a plague of locusts wiping out your crops and bringing on famine. There was the economic fear of the tribute collector, his shadow a harbinger of your family's potential ruin. There was the civic fear of being conscripted for the deadly labor draft, a one-way ticket to a quarry miles from home. And always there was the physical fear of a warrior raid, a summary judgment, or a sudden demand for a sacrificial victim. This was a world defined by its profound unpredictability. As a peasant, you had virtually no control over the major forces that shaped your life. The success of your harvest depended on the whims of the rain god, Tlaloc. Your safety depended on the political ambitions of your emperor. Your very life depended on the hunger of the sun god Huitzilopochtli. This utter lack of agency, this sense of being a helpless pawn in a cosmic game, would have fostered a deep and pervasive anxiety. The Aztec calendar itself, with its intricate cycle of 18 months, was a relentless schedule of dread. Each month was host to specific religious festivals, and each festival had a price. One month the priests might demand a tribute of woven cloaks, the next they might require a quota of captives for sacrifice. The calendar was not a joyful procession of holidays, it was a recurring invoice from the gods, and the bill was always coming due. The very landscape around you became a tapestry of fear. A rustle in the cornfield at dusk wasn't just the wind, it could be a raiding party from Tlaxcala. A strange cloud formation wasn't just weather, it was a celestial omen, a sign of divine displeasure. The Great Pyramid you could see from your field was not a symbol of civic pride or a testament to your culture's greatness. It was a state-sanctioned slaughterhouse, a place where people like you met a terrifying end. Now, it is crucial to understand that their complex and powerful religion was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided the primary framework for understanding a chaotic and often terrifying world. The sun rose because the gods were fed. The corn grew because you performed the correct rituals. Religion gave meaning to your suffering, casting it not as random misfortune, but as a vital part of a grand cosmic drama. This was reinforced by personal and household rituals, making small offerings of food or incense at a tiny family altar, carefully observing sacred days, or performing minor acts of personal bloodletting gave you a small, precious sense of agency. In a world where you controlled almost nothing, these rituals were a way to feel like you were actively participating in your own fate, negotiating with the powerful forces that governed your existence. But here is the cruel twist. The very same belief system that offered this small comfort was also the ultimate justification for your oppression. Your suffering was not an injustice, it was the will of the gods. The emperor's demand for your corn was not a political act, it was a divine mandate. The priest's demand for a human heart was not a brutal murder, it was a sacred duty. Your religion explained your suffering by sanctifying it. You were taught from birth that your station in life was divinely ordained. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, had created the Pipiltin to rule and the Mesoamerica to work. Your life of toil was not a burden, it was your sacred purpose. To question this, to dream of a different life, was to question the wisdom of the gods and the very structure of the universe. It was an act of profound arrogance, and it was unthinkable. This worldview was supercharged with superstition. An unlucky day on the calendar could mean staying home from the fields. The cry of an owl at night could be a portent of impending death. A strange dream, a twitching eye, a snake crossing your path, all were messages from the supernatural world, signs that had to be carefully interpreted. Your daily life was a minefield of omens, each one a potential source of deep anxiety or false hope. This combination of divine mandate and constant uncertainty fostered a powerful sense of fatalism. The Aztecs believed that a person's destiny or tanali was determined at birth, linked to the sacred calendar day on which they entered the world. If your life was one of constant struggle and misfortune, it was perhaps because you were simply born on an unlucky day. This fatalism could lead to a quiet resignation, an acceptance of suffering as not just necessary but inevitable. This brings us to the user's wonderfully concise summary of the peasant's plight. Your gods demanded blood, your emperor demanded corn, you just wanted a day off. This captures the essence of the psychological pressure. You were crushed between the immense, abstract demands of the cosmos and the concrete, relentless demands of the state. There was no space left for the individual. In fact, the very concept of the individual, as we understand it today, was actively suppressed. You were not encouraged to think of yourself as a unique person with your own dreams and desires. You were, first and foremost, a member of your kalpali. You were a subject of the emperor. You were a servant of the gods. Your identity was defined by your obligations to the collective, and personal ambition was a dangerous and disruptive idea. This system could also erode trust within the community. The communal responsibility for tribute meant that your neighbor's laziness could become your problem. The harsh laws against slander and gossip were a response to the tensions that simmered just below the surface. Fear of being accused of a crime or of being selected for a special tribute could turn neighbor against neighbor. Your community was both your only safety net and the walls of your cage. This all paints a picture of a life lived in a state of quiet desperation. This is not to say there was never any joy. There surely were moments of profound happiness. The relief of a successful harvest, the celebration of a marriage, the birth of a healthy child, the communal intoxication of a festival after a generous swig of pulque. But these moments were likely small islands of light in a vast, dark ocean of anxiety and fatigue. The psychological toll on the family unit is almost impossible to imagine. The constant fear of losing a child to dysentery or to the priests of Tlaloc, the gnawing grief of a husband and father who never returned from a war or a labor project, the unimaginable trauma of having to sell a child into slavery to prevent the rest of the family from starving. These were the emotional realities that defined family life. For many men, the only perceived escape, the only path to a form of glory, was to embrace the idea of a good death. To die bravely in battle or to face the sacrificial knife with stoicism was considered the most honorable end a man could achieve. It was believed to guarantee a desirable afterlife, allowing the soul to accompany the sun on its daily journey across the sky. This belief was a powerful psychological tool that encouraged both military fervor and a grim acceptance of sacrifice. So let us sum up the immense weight on the peasant's mind. They were caught in a perfect, self-justifying machine of oppression. The tribute system stripped them of their sustenance. The labor draft drained them of their energy. The legal system denied them justice. The constant warfare threatened them with violent capture. And the state religion, in a stroke of genius, convinced them this was all a sacred and necessary part of the cosmic order. The psychological burden was the final lock on this cage. By internalizing the belief that their suffering was not only inevitable but righteous, the peasant became a participant in their own subjugation. How can you rebel against a system when you believe it is holding up the sun itself? This was the ultimate victory of the Aztec state. It colonized not just the land but the minds of its people. And yet, despite this overwhelming system, they endured. They loved, they laughed, they raised families, and they worked. They built the pyramids, they paved the causeways, they grew the food. Their story is not just one of suffering, but of a quiet, stubborn resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. They were the forgotten foundation of a legendary empire. So why did it suck to be an Aztec peasant? It sucked because every aspect of your life, your work, your food, your body, your family, your very thoughts, was controlled by a ruthless imperial system. It sucked because you were a disposable cog in this machine, and you were taught to see the gears that crushed you as divine and beautiful. We have now reached the end of our long, dark journey into the life of the Aztec commoner. We have witnessed their world from nearly every angle, and I hope it has been as illuminating for you as it has been for me. The story of the peasant is the story of most of humanity throughout history, and it deserves to be told in all its grim detail. If this exploration of the dark truths of the past has been meaningful to you, then the most important tribute you can pay is to subscribe to this channel. Liking this video ensures these stories reach a wider audience. Do not let the quiet desperation of millions be forgotten by the passage of time. Click subscribe and become a guardian of history's most uncomfortable and most important truths. Greetings, and welcome to the final, bitter epilogue of our series on the Aztec peasant. We have stood with them in the fields, the temples, and the courts. We have felt their hunger, their fear, and their hopelessness. We have chronicled a life lived under a system of meticulous, soul-crushing oppression. And just when you thought it couldn't possibly get any worse, strange men in metal shells riding on giant beasts arrived from across the great Eastern Ocean. The year was 1519 on the European calendar, or one reed on the Aztec calendar. This was a year of profound significance, as it was the very year the exiled feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, was prophesied to return. So, when Hernán Cortés and his band of conquistadors landed on the coast, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II was paralyzed by indecision. Was this a returning god, or something else entirely? For the common people, steeped in superstition, the world already felt like it was ending. In the years leading up to the Spanish arrival, a series of terrifying omens had been reported. A comet that burned like a fiery ear of corn in the daytime sky, the mysterious boiling of the waters of Lake Texcoco, the phantom cry of a weeping woman, mourning for her children in the streets of the capital at night. The world was already gripped by a supernatural dread. Then came the reports of the strangers themselves, wielding a kind of terrifying magic. They carried thunder sticks that spat fire and death from a distance. They rode upon massive deer that were faster and stronger than any known animal. They were clad in shining metal that could turn away obsidian blades, and they were accompanied by ferocious war dogs trained to tear men apart. This was not war as the Aztecs knew it. This was something alien and terrifying. Here we must address the most critical factor in the Spanish conquest, a fact often overlooked in popular retellings. Hernán Cortés did not conquer an empire of millions with just a few hundred men. He was the catalyst, not the cause. He was quickly joined by tens of thousands of warriors from other Mesoamerican peoples, most notably the fierce Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans had been locked in centuries of brutal flower wars with the Aztecs, and they harbored a deep and burning hatred for their oppressors. They saw the Spanish not as invaders, but as their best and only hope for vengeance. From the perspective of an ordinary peasant, especially one living in a subjugated province, the arrival of these powerful strangers might have been a cause for hope. You spent your entire life paying tribute to the hated Aztecs. You lived in constant fear of their raiding parties and their sacrificial demands. Now, suddenly, here was a new power on the board, and they were pointing their thundersticks directly at your overlords. The enemy of my enemy, as they say, is my friend. For countless commoners, the subsequent war and the fall of Tenochtitlan must have felt like a long-awaited liberation. The Great Pyramid, the center of their world's terror, was under siege. The flow of tribute to the capital was cut off. The seemingly invincible eagle and jaguar warriors were falling to Spanish steel and Tlaxcalan spears. For a brief, glorious moment, it must have seemed like the nightmare was finally over. The siege of the Aztec capital was one of the most brutal chapters in military history. The fighting in the streets was savage, but the true conqueror of Tenochtitlan was an invisible ally of the Spanish: smallpox. The disease, to which the native population had absolutely no immunity, tore through the crowded city like a wildfire. It killed a massive portion of the population, including warriors, priests, and even the emperor himself, leaving the survivors too weak to fight. In the summer of 1521, the great city fell. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured, and the empire that had dominated Mesoamerica for a century ceased to exist. The temples were looted, the idols were smashed, and the reign of Huitzilopochtli came to a bloody and decisive end. A new flag was raised over the smoking ruins of the city. A new era had begun. But the great dying was just getting started. In the century that followed the conquest, successive waves of European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, swept across the land. This was the true Kokkalistli, the great pestilence. Historians estimate that as much as 90% of the indigenous population of Mesoamerica perished. It was a demographic catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, one of the bleakest chapters in all of human history. For the peasants who survived this apocalypse, a grim realization began to dawn. The Spanish were not liberators. They had looked at the Aztec Empire's brutally efficient system of tribute and forced labor, and they didn't see something evil to be destroyed. They saw a fantastic business model, a machine of exploitation that just needed a new set of managers at the top. This brings us to our final, grim punchline, the sad summary of the peasant's fate. You thought the Aztecs sucked? Hold my attorney. The initial relief of being freed from Aztec rule quickly curled into the horror of realizing they had merely swapped one master for another. And this new master had his own uniquely European methods of oppression. The Spanish immediately implemented the encomienda system. In theory, this was a grant from the Spanish crown to a conquistador or settler, giving them the right to demand tribute and forced labor from a specific number of native people, in exchange for which they were supposed to provide protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it was a system of chattel slavery by another name, and it was horrifically brutal. The tribute did not stop. It simply changed its address. Now, instead of sending a portion of your maize and woven cloth to Tenochtitlan, you sent it to your local Spanish encomendero. You were forced to grow new crops like wheat and sugarcane, and raise new animals like cattle and sheep, all for the benefit of your new European master. The burden was the same, and often it was even heavier. Your entire spiritual world was declared demonic and systematically destroyed. The temples were torn down and churches were built directly on top of their foundations, often using the very same stones. You were forcibly converted to Catholicism, your children baptized with new Spanish names. The gods you had been taught to fear and appease your entire life were now declared to be devils, and worshipping them was a heresy punishable by torture and death. The Spanish also introduced a new form of hell on earth that the Aztecs had never practiced on a large scale: industrial mining. The discovery of massive silver deposits created an insatiable demand for labor. Thousands upon thousands of native men were forced into the dark, terrifying mines of places like Zacatecas, where they toiled in horrific conditions. They died from tunnel collapses, from exhaustion, and from the slow, creeping death of mercury poisoning. Your relationship with the land also changed forever. Under the Aztecs, you worked communal land belonging to your calpulli. Under the Spanish, the concept of private property was aggressively imposed. The best lands were seized and consolidated into massive private estates called haciendas, owned by a handful of wealthy Spanish families. The peasants who had worked that land for generations became landless serfs, or peons, trapped in a cycle of debt and servitude. The Aztec legal system, with its harsh but predictable rules, was swept away and replaced by Spanish colonial law. In theory, the Spanish crown passed laws to protect its new native subjects from the worst abuses. Figures like the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas fought passionately for the rights of the indigenous peoples, but in practice, a poor, native-speaking peasant had almost no chance of winning a legal case against a powerful, wealthy, Spanish-speaking landowner. Imagine the profound and total psychological trauma of this experience. Your entire world has been literally and figuratively shattered. Your rulers are dead, your temples are rubble, your gods have been defeated and declared to be demons, your neighbors and family are dying from incomprehensible diseases, your land has been taken, and you are now a serf in your own home. It was a complete and total apocalypse. So we are left with the grim question: was the life of a peasant better or worse after the Spanish conquest? It is a horrifying question to even contemplate. The constant state-sanctioned threat of being ritually sacrificed was gone, and that is no small thing, but it was replaced by the constant threat of being worked to death in a silver mine, of losing your land entirely, and of dying from a plague you couldn't even comprehend. Ultimately, it was a transition from one form of organized, ritualized oppression to a more chaotic, greedy, and perhaps even more catastrophic form of colonial exploitation. The Aztec Empire was a machine designed to consume your labor and your spirit. The Spanish Empire was a machine designed to consume your labor, your spirit, and all the gold and silver that lay beneath your feet. Yet, through it all, the people endured. This is the final, crucial part of the story. They survived the Aztecs. They survived the Spanish conquest. They survived the plagues and the mines and the loss of their land. Their descendants are the vibrant indigenous communities of Mexico today. Their languages, their foods, their traditions, and their worldview were not erased. They survived, blended, and adapted, a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. But for that one peasant living through the turmoil of the 16th century, their life was a tragedy bookended by two different empires. They were born a subject of a priest-king who demanded their corn and their hearts. They died a subject of a foreign king who demanded their silver and their souls. The names of the gods and the masters changed, but the fundamental reality of a life of hardship remained tragically, brutally the same. Our long, dark journey into the life of the Aztec peasant must end here, at the dawn of a new and equally painful chapter in their history. The story of the common person is often one of survival against odds that seem insurmountable. If you believe these are the stories that truly matter, the ones that form the bedrock of our world, then you must subscribe. Liking this video helps us unearth more of these hidden histories. Thank you for joining us. Now click subscribe and let's see what other dark corners of the past we can illuminate together. We have reached the end of our long, dark road, a journey into the heart of one of history's most fascinating and brutal empires, seen through the eyes of its most numerous and most miserable inhabitants. We have asked, time and again, why it sucked to be a peasant in the Aztec Empire. Now, as we stand at the summit of this pyramid of suffering and look back, the answer is crushingly clear. It sucked because the peasant was not a citizen of the empire, they were its fuel. Their lives were the engine of a relentless economic machine. The tribute system was a marvel of organized extortion, siphoning away the very food from their mouths to feed the priests, nobles, and warriors who lived in splendor. Their bodies were a source of free, conscripted labor, the coquequil, that broke their backs to quarry the stones and raise the very temples where their own subjugation was celebrated as a cosmic necessity. They were born into a debt to the state that could only be paid with a lifetime of toil. Physically, their existence was a grueling war of attrition against the world. Their diet, a monotonous cycle of maize and beans, was just enough to keep them working, but it left them vulnerable and chronically undernourished. They lived in a world rife with disease, where a simple infection could be a death sentence, and contaminated water was a constant threat. Their days were spent in back-breaking labor, with tools so primitive they were little more than sharpened sticks, every calorie earned paid for with a gallon of sweat. They were trapped in an ingenious social cage. The Aztec legal system, for all its complexity, was a weapon pointed downwards, designed to enforce obedience and punish any deviation with brutal efficiency. It was a tool for maintaining order, not dispensing justice. The social ladder was a cruel illusion. Born a peasant, you died a peasant. Your purpose was not to dream or to achieve, but to serve the station you were born into without question. Looming over every aspect of this life was the ever-present, blood-soaked shadow of the pyramid. If you lived on the frontiers, you lived in constant fear of the flower wars, where you were little more than prey for elite hunters seeking captives for the altar. And no matter where you lived, you understood that the gods were thirsty. Human sacrifice was the central pillar of your religion and your state, a terrifying lottery where the losing ticket meant a one-way trip to the top of the temple to have your heart offered to the sun. The cumulative psychological toll is almost impossible for us to comprehend. It was a life defined by a constant, overlapping chorus of fears. Fear of the tax collector, fear of a failed harvest, fear of a warrior raid, fear of a displeased god. Their own religion, the only source of explanation for their world, taught them that their suffering was not only necessary but righteous. They were taught to believe that their misery was the very thing that kept the universe from collapsing into chaos. And so, we see the complete picture. The Aztec peasant was the true, unsung and utterly forgotten foundation of this mighty empire. Their anonymous labor built the glorious city of Tenochtitlan. Their endless tribute fed the armies that conquered Mesoamerica. Their unquestioning obedience upheld the power of the emperor. And in the end, their very blood was the sacred mortar that held the whole terrifying structure together. The grandeur of the Aztecs was built directly upon the misery of the many. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, lulled by this tale of historical hardship, take a moment. Be grateful for your comfortable bed, your varied diet, and the merciful absence of demands for human sacrifice in your modern tax filings. Remember the silent, suffering millions who built a fearsome empire with their bare hands and then were told to be grateful for the privilege. Thanks for listening tonight, and may your dreams be peaceful, and your history lessons profoundly unsaid. If this journey has been a worthy one, please show your support for unvarnished history by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It's the only way these stories can continue to be told.